Okay, everybody. So let me see if we can see me. Yep, there I am. And I've discovered virtual backgrounds. Pretty cool. Okay, so this is meant to be a very short video to provide some helpful information on if you happen to have a Windows host. So on your laptop, you're running Windows, and then I'll talk about a couple of things related to our VM, and we're actually going to change the networking option. Okay, so first thing on Windows, so Windows now supports sort of at a container level, an application level, a Linux, and you can go to Microsoft Store. Okay, and if you look up, for example, Ubuntu 18.04, you should find it. You can click on it, and you should see something that looks like this. Although I've already installed it, and so that's why it says it's installed. You should see something that says uh, install. So just click the install button. It may prompt you for a login. Um, I was able to say don't log in, and it still let me download this. So once this is installed, then if you go to recently added, or if you go to your list of programs, recently added, notice that we've now have Ubuntu 18.04. The first time you click on this, it's going to say something like you need to do the following to complete the Windows configuration to support Ubuntu. And it's going to give you a link that'll point you to this page. So it's well, the link will get you to this page. Windows subsystem for Linux installation guide for Windows 10. And so you basically just need to run this command from the PowerShell. You need to run the PowerShell as an administrator. Okay, this is the only complicated part of this. Also, be aware that once you do this, you hit enter to do this command. It's going to do a couple of things, and then within seconds, it's going to immediately restart your program. So beware. Okay, so let me talk about a PowerShell. In Windows, there's a command shell. So if we search for command prompt, we get one of these things, which has been around for 30 years. And it gives you some basic, a basic interface to a Windows operating system. You can actually do software development within this sort of mini shell that they provide. There's some similarities to Unix. So instead of if config, I think it's IP config, and that shows you all the interface information. So my laptop is running Wi-Fi, so I'm located in my house, and this is the IP address 0.20 that I'm using. Okay, also in Windows, there is a PowerShell. Okay, and so it's an app that is basically a souped up command prompt. So you could do a lot more from the PowerShell. There's a scripting language. There's a ton of commands. It's the equivalent to Bash on a Linux system. But I would suggest, unless you end up having to be an administrator in a job at some point in the future where you have to maintain Windows machines, you probably, hopefully, won't ever need to really learn all that much about a Windows PowerShell. As I said, the only trick here is when we run this command in the PowerShell, so we can copy it and then go to the PowerShell and select Run as Administrator. If you just click on the PowerShell, you're not an administrator, and that command is going to fail. So Run as Administrator. And I don't even know if this is going to work. Oh, it does. Okay. So this was the command, and doing an echo, double quote, and then pasting lets you look at what the command is before actually running it. So you would actually, the next step would be to run that command. And I'm not going to run it because I've already ran it. Once you run it, it's going to reboot your system, and then you can, once you restart, you can launch Ubuntu, which I already have, and so we're seeing my window here. And so now the next step is it's going to do some sort of Unixy installation type things. So enter new Unix username, JJM. Okay, to run a command as an administrator, use sudo, okay, which is just like what we do in our Ubuntu VirtualBox environment. And so basically most commands, Unix commands are available. So the exception, as I said, or might have said, is some of the networking things are that we would expect on a Linux laptop will be different. And so this is telling us okay, so on my previous laptop running an early version of Linux integrated with Windows using Ubuntu 16.04, the ifconfig information was not correct. And so maybe they have gotten closer towards being more of a true Linux system. But anyways, the point is that this is very useful because you can do, well, actually the thing I use this for mostly is I can now SSH into any machine, right? So I'm running the our VPN, or I hope I am. Right, so I'm running our Cisco AnyConnect. You definitely should be running that. You go to CCIT and search for Cisco AnyConnect. It gets you to a page, and there's a really easy installation process. And the only thing you have to remember is after it's installed, you have to specify this address, cuvpn.clemson.edu. So that is our VPN endpoint. Okay, in this Ubuntu apt install works. So like, let's see if we have GCC, no. So I would do something like sudo apt install build essential, I think it's called. So basically that's a bunch of stuff that, that will get you started. Okay, so that was one thing I wanted to show you. The second thing is, as I went through this process of installing VirtualBox on a new machine, I realized that I never made a video that sort of walked us through some of the sticky points or the finer points. So let me just point out a few things. I think most of you have picked up on these at this point. The VM that I'm running, I obtained, it's basically a clone of the VM on my previous laptop. So if we go to VirtualBox Manager, okay, so yesterday on my previous laptop, I was running VM1 and VirtualBox Manager. I created an appliance. So basically that's how you clone your VM, and you would click here and go through a couple panels. It's very simple to do. You should probably think through where you want to locate the file that it's going to create. So okay, I try and keep everything related to VirtualBox in a directory called VirtualBox VMs. This is the appliance that I made. It's there's several formats that you can choose from, and I did the default. It's open virtual format. So I could post this VM appliance and anybody could download it, and using any VMM, whether it's VirtualBox or VMware or possibly KVM, you would be able to import this appliance and you'd be up and running within minutes. So it's a super cool way to create sort of pre-built, customized distributions. Also located in this directory. So I set the shared folder on my VirtualBox config to point to this directory. And so let me show settings and shared folders. And so by default, you won't have any shared folders set up. So you have to actually create a new one. So you would do a plus to create a new one. And it'll give you once you do plus, it'll prompt you for the location, and you could browse the host file system. And so that's how I selected this folder. And I said auto mount, which says, yes, whenever I boot the VM, always have the VM shared folder mounted, and access is, I think, read-write access. Okay, so if we go to my VM, I'm going to get rid of my PowerShell. Here's my VM. Okay, you'll actually notice I have what appears to be 2 VMs running, and let's actually go to the config for my VM, and I'll point out a couple of things. So okay, so it says snapshot folder. So a snapshot is another thing you may want to just keep in the back of your mind. It's a way to obtain a sort of a backup of your VM at that moment when you create a snapshot. And so there's a way, I think it's back in the top level command. So go into file, and I'm looking for how to create a snapshot. It may be in the machine configuration. It must be in the machine configuration. So machine. Actually, it might be in tools. Okay, it's in tools. So this is how you would make a snapshot. And so it would place it in that, you would probably place it in that VirtualBox directory that we pointed out, just so that everything is in the same place. Be wary that these files are huge. So when I did a clone, or when I created the appliance, the file produced was on the order of 10 gigabytes. All right, so back in machine settings. So this is the settings that will apply only to this particular VM. So I've set up the shared clipboard and drag and drop for bidirectional. System, so I use 2 gig of memory, and these, I believe, are all just defaults. So notice that we can't click those, and that's because there's certain configuration options that you can't change while the VM is running. We'd have to stop the VM, then we could change these. I usually, by default, it's going to give you a single CPU. My appliance was using 2 CPUs, and I went ahead and increased that to 4 CPUs because this laptop has 8. And hardware virtualization is enabled. Okay, display. Again, depending on how much memory you have on your laptop, you could reduce this or make it bigger. 64 megabytes works well. I increased the monitor count to 2. That's why we see 2 VMs running. Okay, and you don't need to do that. It's just sometimes convenient. The scale factor will increase the size of what things look like in the VM. So by default, it was just above min and things were too small. And so I increased it to 200 times. It's on this laptop, it seemed to like this graphics controller, and I enabled 3D acceleration. If you go to storage, you'll see VirtualBox guest editions, which means it has been run. The VM1, so basically the state associated with that virtual computer is in this file. It's a VDI file, and you should see that in that directory that contains all of our VirtualBox stuff. Again, think of it as the image of your VM, including the disk data. So, it's likely to be 10 gig or larger. Okay, so this is the last thing I'm going to talk about. Originally, by default, we will use what's called NAT, Network Address Translation, for networking. Basically, that we'll talk more about that later in the semester. It's one way of allowing the VM to reach the outside world. An alternative is a bridged adapter. And again, notice that I can't click this on or off because I have an active VM, but it's running in bridged mode. So what bridged mode means is, so now I'm going to try to use the whiteboard. Okay. All right, so let's say this is our network, and this is our guest. OS, also called VM1. And then this, gosh, I draw like a kindergartner. This is our base host. I guess it's called the host OS. And just to help me make my point, I have on my network, I have another machine. It's has some weird name, JJM or JJM Nook, and you see 1. And it's a Wi-Fi network 192.168.0/24. That means all of the hosts should have a 192.168.0 dot something. If we look at our host OS, the Wi-Fi IP is 192.168.0.20. That's our host OS. So 192. Let me try something. 192.168.0.20. All right. Do I have an eraser? Yes. Let's see. Okay, the address of JJM Nook 1. Need to go see. Rats. SSHing into a different machine here for a second, just so that I can get the IP address of JJM Nook 1. So, all right, it's 0.22. 0.22. Okay. Okay, so the address of JJM Nook 1 is 192.168.0.22, and the address of our VM used to be 10.0.0.15, I believe, and it used NAT, and by the end of the semester you'll understand what that means. But switching it to a bridge mode, basically it makes it appear as if that Linux VM is directly connected to this 192.168.0/24 network. And by default, it's going to use DHCP to, when it boots, to broadcast a request for DHCP information. Let's see. So the router, how do I do free drawing? So the router, oh boy. is right there. And it's actually an AP, a Wi-Fi AP. Its address is 192.168.0.1. Okay. And so let's now look at our VM to see what this address is. All right, so our address is 0.71. Uh, 168.0.71. Okay. And what this does for us is we can now SSH into our VM, and there's a few more steps that are required, such as installing OpenSSH, so that you get SSH daemon, and I'll actually be writing up the instructions for how to do that, because we want to get everyone to the point where even from your host OS, so for my laptop, I can SSH into my VM. 71. Okay, and so as long as you know the address of your VM, you can SSH into it. And so I'll end with that for now.